A long time ago, perhaps in a galaxy far, far away, I was a teenager. Yeah, it's a true story. And one I find hard to believe myself because I still feel and sometimes act like one. Anyway, as a teenager, I discovered music, and I was fortunate to discover music, I think, in a time when there was so much experimentation being made, as well as many diverse styles like rock, disco, folk, blues, pop, reggae, classical rock fusion, jazz rock fusion, the lot. So what I'd like to do in this video is share with you 20 albums that shaped my taste in music. Now, it's not a definitive list in as much as I have an eclectic taste, and to list every artist and genre that moves me would probably move you to tears. But in this video, I'm going to walk you through 20 albums that for one reason or another kind of pricked up my ears, and for a young, impressionable wannabe musician, these albums affected me in such a way that they've remained firm favourites, kind of like in the songbook of my life. A little like Stevie Wonder's Songs in the Key of Life, right? Although I'm not listing him in the list of 20 albums, but he does fit in there somewhere down the line. Now, the list is in no particular order. It's not a countdown from 20 to 1, and it's just a list. Now, you may not see albums that you like in the list, but then we have differing tastes, right? And my list is probably shaped by any situation I found myself in or a place I was in when I first heard them. Now, I grew up in Scandinavia and Germany in my teens, so the music I listened to was not so prevalent in the UK. For instance, new wave or punk rock was almost never heard of in Scandinavia. Right, that's it then, let's get into this. Now, I was on a school trip to Gränna in Sweden, and I was 15. And I remember being violently ill on the first night. And so the next day, while the class were out gallivanting around, doing their school trip type stuff, as you do, I was left behind at the site in the care of some adults. Well, you know, to a 15-year-old, the grown-ups of 18 and 20 seemed like adults. Anyway, they had the War of the Worlds LP in the rec room, and as an English kid, they were interested to know my thoughts on the album. Now, having not heard the new album that had just been released, we sat through all 4 sides of the double LP, and it blew me away. The album was a musical adapted version of science fiction novel The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells in a rock opera style, with a rock band, an orchestra and narration to carry the lyrics that expressed the feelings of the various characters. Now, that mix of prog rock, that amazing artwork and that you could immerse yourself in, Richard Burton's narration, and the eclectic mix of artists and musicians such as Chris Spedding, Herbie Flowers, Justin Hayward, Chris Thompson, David Essex and Phil Lynott, made an indelible impression on me, and I've loved this album ever since. I think for me, if I'm going to choose a standout song for this album, it's going to be Forever Autumn.
Now you're not here.
This is an amazing album, and it was an amazing debut album for the then 19-year-old Kate Bush. And the album had a certain quirkiness about it, but musically ticked all the boxes for me. And I would spend much of my time going over liner notes and reading lyrics as I listened to albums on the headphones, locking out the world so it was just me and the symphonic sounds that I was listening to. Now, I didn't mind the music on this album because initially it felt like I was listening to the Alan Parsons Project. And the album was produced by Andrew Powell, who also wrote the orchestral scores, as well as having David Payton on bass, Ian Bairnson, who sadly recently passed away, on guitars. Do you remember his amazing solo at the end of Wuthering Heights? And Stuart Tosh on drums. Now, 3 of these players, as well as Andrew Powell, were from the Alan Parsons Project stable. And in fact, Ian, David and Stuart were originally in Pilot, whose hits Magic and January were produced by Alan Parsons. It's amazing how session musicians and producers are all kind of interlinked. I feel a video coming on there. Anyway, the kick inside invokes in me a yearning. It's like Kate captures the essence of our childhood memories and brings them to life in music. I've been an admirer of her work ever since the kick inside. Standout tune? It's a tough one, but I'm going with James and the Cold Gun. I hadn't listened to any Genesis music. In fact, the band didn't figure in the hit list of my cassette collection, so I didn't know who Phil Collins was. So again, I'm in Sweden. I was listening to a radio program, and the host was doing a complete listen through of the whole album. Maybe the kind of thing they used to do on Swedish radio, I don't know. I can't remember why I tuned in, but I caught the show at track 1. And obviously In the Air Tonight sounded intriguing, but the whole album I found to be utterly amazing. The infusion of third world sounds was new to my ears, as well as the other great tunes like I'm Not Moving and If Leaving Me Is Easy. What an amazing album, and I loved his music ever since. I think the horn section from Earth, Wind and Fire made it sound kind of familiar, as I loved the EWF sound anyway. Standout tune, it's tough because I like the whole album, but I'm going with I'm Not Moving. No, wait, I missed again. No, hang on. In the Air Tonight. No, that's too overplayed. I don't like overplayed songs, do I? Yeah, back to I'm Not Moving.
If you think you say it, don't stand so close to me.
Who doesn't love the Police? This is a strange one. I was in a record store in Gothenburg and Do 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 Da 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 was playing, and I liked the song and the groove and the bass line, but I didn't know it was the Police. In fact, Zenyatta Mondatta was my first introduction to the band, and it was their third album. Now I saw the LP displayed on a counter, and it was kind of like it's playing now. And I'd remembered seeing the promo video on television for Don't Stand So Close to Me, and I made the connection. And it didn't take me long to get hooked, getting the previous 2 albums and subsequent albums of Sting and his solo albums. It's a firm favourite of mine. In fact, I would even hazard a guess, it'd be a long time, that the first bass riff I ever learnt was Walking on the Moon, and that was while playing it on my acoustic guitar. Standout tune? I like the kind of medley mishmash of Driven to Tears and When the World is Running Down. The Alan Parsons Project.
Therefore, we shall call it the Alan Parsons Project.
It's the summer of 1977, Oslo, Norway. A fellow student, now a connected friend on Facebook, called Stephen Thompson, who attended a different international school than me, suggested I might like the Alan Parsons Project. And he wasn't wrong. It's right up my street. I, Robot is the second studio album by the Alan Parsons Project, released the 8th of July 1977, and the album draws conceptually on author Isaac Asimov's science fiction robot stories, exploring philosophical themes regarding artificial intelligence. Now, Alan Parsons had, as you may know if you're a Beatles fan, cut his engineering teeth working at Abbey Road for EMI, first as an assistant tape operator on Abbey Road and Let It Be. And he would go on to produce the likes of John Miles, Steve Harley and Cockney Rebel, Al Stewart, Pilot and Ambrosia, as well as producing Pink Floyd's The Dark Side of the Moon. Now, in 1975, he declined Pink Floyd's invitation to work on Wish You Were Here, which was the follow-up to Dark Side of the Moon, and instead initiated the Alan Parsons Project with producer, songwriter and occasional singer Eric Wolfson, whom he met at Abbey Road. Now, the project consisted of a revolving group of studio musicians and vocalists, most notably the members of Pilot, who I mentioned earlier. Now, I, Robot, for me, is one of those seminal albums in the vein of Tubular Bells. And if you've not heard it, then you've got to give it a listen, especially with headphones on. The way that first track, I, Robot, starts, it's just bliss. So, in fact, the standout track for me is I, Robot. Been following 10cc, and I mean, who didn't in the 70s, right, with their hits like I'm Not in Love, The Wall Street Shuffle, Donna, I'm Mandy Fly Me, all consistently played on the radio. Now, as an initial quartet of Kevin Godley, Lol Creme, Eric Stewart and Graham Gouldman, I was already listening to their previous albums, the original soundtrack and How Dare You. But then Deceptive Bends came out, and to me it was like they've arrived. But actually, as the years went on, I could see that the duo were actually not as hot as had they continued as a quartet. But at the time, I thought Eric and Graham could carry it sufficiently. So by the time Deceptive Bends was released, the band had split due to creative differences. But Eric Stewart and Graham Gouldman continued and drafted in new musicians, a few of whom continued to play with Graham to this day, Rick Fenn and Paul Burgess. Both were on Deceptive Bends album. Now this is another headphones type of album for me, especially the three-part song Feel the Benefit, which is totally immersive. But the music, the musicianship, the writing, it all works. And Eric Stewart's guitar playing, is he not one of the most underrated guitarists of all time? I think another video to think about. Standout track for me, Good Morning Judge, with its kind of dueling guitar solos in the left and the right ear. When this album came out in '77, I was in grade 8 at an American international school in Oslo. And school discos and teenage parties were all the rage, and Dreams was the #1 song on everyone's playlist. It's not a dance tune, and it's not a slow song to dance to, so it was a bit difficult. But in terms of music, I was again in a place where I could put the LP on the turntable and put the headphones on, and starting from track 1 on side 1, flipping it over, and then track 1 on side 2 all the way to the end, was something to absorb. Now, I was not aware at the time of Peter Green's Fleetwood Mac. So this new incarnation of Fleetwood Mac is the one that I've grown up with. Mick Fleetwood has commented that Rumours was the most important album they'd ever created. And as of October 2019, the album had spent 800 weeks in the UK Top 100 album chart, and is the 11th best-selling album in UK history. It's an album that I'll let the tracks play all the way through instead of skipping. And, you know, if a track comes on. Standout track? I'm actually going to go for Never Going Back Again, probably because of Lindsey Buckingham's guitar work. But of course, Dreams is the top track, isn't it? But Never Going Back Again. I know Out of the Blue is probably ELO's biggest commercial success, but A New World Record was for me a magical introduction to their music. Now, I'd known about Evil Woman and Strange Magic as they were tunes that were always on the radio. But again, the summer of '77 and the memories this album evokes, for me, make it really special. I think for me this album has elements of prog rock. Not that I'm a big fan of prog rock, but the use of synths and orchestra, as well as guitars, bass and keys, made this album really stand out for me as pure pop rock music in an era where disco was king, glam rock had waned, and punk rock and anarchy were just around the corner. A New World record seemed to sit comfortably in a niche all of its own. For me, the standout track is Telephone Line.
I just can't believe they've all faded out of you.
I had to put this on my list, didn't I? The fifth commercial release by McCartney and Wings. It's funny how my choice of albums all fit in a period of awakening for me, you know, like LPs from my early teenage years. I do have a number of favourites from kind of modern times, modern bands, that kind of thing, but it's the music of the 70s that moves me the most, and I have actually done a separate video on my love of this album, so much that I think I'll leave a link in the description and at the top of your screen. Standout track? Silly Love Songs, of course.
How can I tell you about my loved one? Oh, sweet painted lady.
Now, this album was a favourite of an aunt of mine. She's 3 years older than me. So kind of still in the same age group. Extended families, don't ask. So it had a lot of airplay in the houses that I grew up in. So naturally I became accustomed to hearing it. Now, the pairing of Elton John's music and Bernie Taupin's lyrics is a work of art. And this could almost be a concept album with some general themes running through it. Through the medium of cinematic metaphor, the album builds a nostalgia for childhood and culture that's left in the past. And they captured the essence really well. And so every listen seems fresh to me. It's also worth mentioning that I was torn between putting this album and the 1976 album Blue Moves, which was also a double album, in this list. Blue Moves is more in tune with my teenage vibe because that's the album that I kind of listened to. But because of the kind of the album coming forward in my sort of pre-teens and sort of 11, 12, 13, I'm going to put it in here. I think the standout track for me, probably because I remember listening to it on a ghetto blaster, walking up this road in Norway. It was dark. I'd gone down to the shops. Is Funeral for a Friend and Love Lies Bleeding. I was listening to it on the cassette, carrying this ghetto blaster, as teenagers do. And it's all this kind of bells and owls and howling wind. It freaked me out because I'm walking past these woods and it's, oh. But then I've subsequently seen it performed live, I think Elton John at the Madison Square Gardens, with Davy Johnson on guitar, and it's just a great tune. So yeah, that's my pick from this album. A Funeral for a Friend, Love Lies Bleeding.
Got bleeding in my hand.
I had to include this, right? Rock opera at its best. The album that put Queen well and truly on the map. This is another album that for me was a listen to on headphones from start to finish, enjoying every track on the album. And I particularly like, as I do with the Beatles and Fleetwood Mac and kind of any band that shares the songwriting and singing, the fact that it's not just a Freddie Mercury show. So you've got John Deacon writing, Roger Taylor and Brian May both do writing and singing. In fact, it's an all-round effort from all of them, and it's all the better for it, in my opinion. Best track? I think My Best Friend, John Deacon composition. It's just a lovely, pure pop song. Wait, Cliff Richard? Bear with me on this. Cliff was big in the 50s, one of the pioneers of rock and roll in the UK, modelling himself as a kind of Elvis Presley, and his popularity waned once the Beatles and the Rolling Stones took a stranglehold on the musical culture, and Cliff's career had all but been snuffed out. Then in 1976 he brought out this album with the hit singles Miss You Night and Devil Woman, and it's the album that brought about Cliff's revival as a major chart act. And the album was produced by Bruce Welch, yep, him of the Shadows, so nice to see a collaboration between the two of them again. Now I'm not sure where the music fits in as a genre, because it's not rock and roll, and it's likely to be kind of a crossover between pop and country rock. Jeff Brown of The Melody Maker was particularly enthusiastic about the album, and he wrote, "Cliff Richard has at last made a sort of album he could and should have been making for years. It is with some incredulity that I have for the past 10 days been playing two albums consistently. One is Marvin Gaye's I Want You, the other is I'm Nearly Famous Now. The renaissance for Richard, for that is what I believe this album heralds, is long overdue. It is the best album of new songs ever, and if there are enough unprejudiced ears around, could well mark the start of a fresh Cliff Richard buying public." So the album resurrected Cliff's career well into the 80s and the early 90s, and especially his work with Alan Tarney. But I remember buying this album in a little convenience store in Oslo where I lived, and because of that I'll always have kind of fond memories of it, and it's been a consistent listen to for decades for me. Standout tracks, I'm torn between two, It's No Use Pretending and If You Walked Away. Yeah, they're both lovely tunes.
I tried to please you, but all you could do was talk behind my back. Why do we always have a stormy weather? Why?
My first recollection of Leo Sayer coming on the scene was seeing his performance of The Show Must Go On, probably 72. It was his second single performed in the musical style of a vaudeville clown. And that look wasn't going to last, but he did at least leave a legacy of 16 albums filled with soulful pop tunes. And I think he hit the big time with his 1976 album Endless Flight, produced by Richard Perry, which contained hits like You Make Me Feel Like Dancing and When I Need You, and the album title track Endless Flight, which was written by Andrew Gold. But his 1978 album, self-titled Leo Sayer, is the standout album for me. Again produced by Richard Perry, it contained the hits I Can't Stop Loving You. But for me it was the inclusion of top musicians and the brilliant tunes. You had Andy Fairweather-Low on guitar, Lindsey Buckingham on guitar for Something Fine, which was a Jackson Browne cover, which also credits Jackson Browne as a performer on the album, for vocals. The full Toto band is on this album. David Page, Steve Lukather, Jeff and Steve Procoro, and Bobby Kimball on backing vocals. It's an album that ticked all the boxes for me as a young listener. Excited to see the crossover of artists from other bands. So the standout track, I think Don't Look Away, actually. It's a real rocker, and probably has Steve Lukather, Yes, good tune. Good tune. Have a listen.
Don't look away, baby. Don't look away.
Of course, I had to include this, right? Again, summer of 77, Oslo American School, teenage hormones raging, school dances, day trips to the fjords with my ghetto blaster and friends, and the album playing on a loop. Glorious memories. take the internal squabbles and band disunity out of the equation, separate the artist from the art, and you get an amazing album. New Kid in Town was a favourite, as was the title track, Hotel California. Life in the Fast Lane with Joe Walsh's brilliant Pretty Maids all in a row. Lovely album. 1, 2, 3, 4. So yeah, my standout track, Victim of Love. Although BTO was already a stable fodder in my LP and cassette collection, they came out with this gem in 1977. It was their 7th studio album, and in fact the last album that Randy Bachman would be part of until the reunion in 1994. Many of the BTO core fans didn't like the album, as it was not heavy guitar-driven rock and roll that BTO were known for. And Fred Turner was reportedly so unhappy with the album that he wouldn't allow a straight-on picture of himself to be used on the cover, saying he felt more like a sideman. He went so far as to state that Freeways should have been a Randy Bachman solo album. Randy Bachman wrote every song apart from Life Still Goes On, I'm Lonely, while only 2 of the album's 8 songs featured Fred Turner as the lead vocalist. Now, as a young musician getting into guitar and only having an acoustic, it meant this kind of music was more accessible to me, and I didn't need to learn those kind of rock guitar 5th chords. I think the album really shows Randy Bachman's talents as a guitarist, and I wonder if he was trying to capture the sound he had originally developed whilst in the Guess Who with Burton Cummings. And I particularly like the tunes Just For You and Easy Groove because they're so laid back. I can see why the fans were disappointed, but for me it's a great album with real sensitivity. But the standout track, Down Down.
Down. We all go down. We all go down.
I love this album. Isn't it funny how an artist or band can have a large catalogue of tracks and albums and yet release something that suddenly captures the imagination of a whole new audience? And this was the case for Chicago 10, with its mega Peter Cetera hit, If You Leave Me Now. The song became the band's first #1 hit in the US and UK, and some band members felt the song's success changed the public's perception of the band, leading to more demand from Columbia Records for ballads, although Robert Lamb has since acknowledged that the band had already started moving away from their politically oriented music into the mainstream. Again, an album owned by my younger aunt. The album cover was the thing that intrigued me. It's like a chocolate bar, what's this? So on went the headphones, the LP was placed on the turntable, and I was hooked from the first track to the last. Danny Seraphine's amazing drums, Terry Kath's amazing guitar work, which had, by the way, mesmerised Jimi Hendrix, who went so far as to say that he thought Chicago's guitarists played 6-string better than he did, and named Kath the best guitarist in the universe. High praise indeed, right? Peter Cetera's amazing bass work, and of course the amazing Chicago horns, Lee Lochner, if I say his name right, James Pankow and Walter Parazada. I discovered a band that crossed over from ballads and rock into jazz fusion rock. It was bliss. Standout track, I'm really torn. I love them all. You Get It Up just sounds like a jam session. Skin Tight it's tight, but I think I'll go with Together Again. That middle 8 kind of pulls right back, rolls back before the great brass solo pops out. Yeah, I love this album. torn here. Is my favourite Santana album Marathon, which contains my ultimate favourite instrumental tune in Aquamarine? Or is it Moonflower, with its mix of studio and live performance recordings? I'll stick with this one, since it has Greg Walker on vocals. Nothing wrong with Alex Lighterwood, who took on the vocal reins for a number of albums after the next album, which was Inner Secrets. But again, it's the summer of '77, and I'm discovering music, lapping up as many styles and artists as I can. Santana provides a double album of total immersion. Headphones on, block out the world. Latin rock with long sustained guitar notes that are almost orgasmic and sexual in their delivery. A sustained Carlos Santana guitar note on this album is like tantric sex and goes on and on and on. Not that I've ever experienced that, of course, but go and ask Sting about it. Standout track, I'll Be Waiting. Beautiful, beautiful vocals and guitar work. And yes, I like funk too. What a brilliant album. Definitely not disco, though the uneducated might think so. This is almost adult-orientated soul funk, the listening man-woman's funk sound. I think having discovered Chicago horns on Chicago 10, I was then introduced to the EWF horns, and I couldn't get enough. Now this music is joyous, and it makes me feel warm and fuzzy inside. It's perfection and it's fun. In fact, if you've ever seen the live performances of the band and how much fun they're having, you will know that they had a lot of fun in the studio recording their albums. Now, I would continue to follow their efforts for years, and of course, the discovery then of the EWF horns playing on Phil Collins's Face Value was like meeting old friends again. And yes, it was 1977. What was happening to me in '77? 14-year-old discovering life, sport, the opposite sex, and music. How should that list be prioritised, actually? Standout track is a weird one for me because you'd expect fantasy to hit the mark, but I've always gone against the grain, I think, when it comes to hit songs off an album. And I won't buy an album for a hit song. I'll buy an album to discover all the hidden gems that the artist has provided in all the different tracks. So for me, it's the instrumental called Running. The 1978 debut album was like a breath of fresh air in the midst of the smulch of what had become disco. It seemed that the men in suits were happy to make money by recruiting dance producers who themselves were happy to jump on the 74 to 77 disco bandwagon and were churning out sounds that were forcing listeners away from the genre. I'm pretty sure there were disco record burning sessions at one point.
1, 2, 3, boom!
Punk was trying to convince the world that all you needed to do was thrash a guitar, wear some safety pins with spiky hair, and spit at your audience. Then along came this breath of fresh air from the Knopfler brothers and their two chums, John Owsley and Pick Withers, to tell us all about the Sultans of Swing. So dig a little deeper into this album, and it's a gem. Well-crafted lyrics, storytelling, and musicianship. This and the follow-up album of Communique were the pivotal albums for me. Making Movies was, I think, too overproduced, although Love Over Gold did try and capture the sounds of the original two albums. It was around this time that I invented the personal stereo. A Walkman of sorts, if you like. I was taking a daily bus ride to Gothenburg from my home in Stenungsund. some 45-kilometre trip. And I'd carry my workbooks along with my Panasonic Ghetto Blaster in my rucksack with my dad's humongous headphones, and I'd listen to tunes on the bus ride. I was light years ahead of myself. I reckon a Sony entrepreneur must have been on the bus on one of those occasions and thought, that kid with the headphones and his thing, that's a good idea. Now how can I reduce this in size? And the Sony Walkman was born. I think the standout track for me on this album is because it's so laid back and kind of, well, it's six-blade knife anyway.
Six-bladed knife, I'll do anything for you.
And so the last album then on my list comes from Sky, and it's their debut album. An instrumental piece from a group of stellar musicians. John Williams of classic guitar fame. Remember Cavatina, theme tune from The Deer Hunter? That was him. We've got Herbie Flowers on bass, and it's his bass line you hear on Lou Reed's Walk on the Wild Side. Kevin Peake on electric guitars, who had been a long-standing member of the Cliff Richard Band, as well as working with Manfred Mann, Lulu, Tom Jones, Jeff Wayne, Shirley Bassey, and even, should I say this, Gary Glitter. Tristan Fry was on drums, and he actually played timpani on the Beatles' A Day in the Life. And there was Francis Monkman, a former member of the band Curved Air, on keyboards. Now this was a fusion of rock, classical and jazz music, and provided me with my first real introduction to classical guitar music. And I was inspired to learn it, if only a little, as part of my own collective abilities as a musician. It's a shame I never really actually learnt to read music and to play it on an instrument. Everything goes by ear, you see. Anyway, this album provided enough rock to keep me interested. Side 2 is my standout track because it's kind of like the Beatles' Abbey Road medley, but without lyrics. So the concept is not, not the musical style, but the track Where Opposites Meet is a 20-minute extravaganza, which was intended to combine and display the band's diverse influences. So there you go. I'm a bit stuck in the groove in my musical taste, but it's a decent enough pedigree, I think. I never really got into heavy rock like Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, that kind of stuff. It wasn't musical enough for me and for my developing tastes. It all seemed a bit of a mishmash, and it would have me thinking, what's the point? I wonder if you have a list of influential albums, and I bet the list doesn't cross over my list much. Maybe one or two albums I've selected would, feature in your catalogue. But yay for diversity, right? That's what makes us all different. Okay, I'll end it there. I shouldn't really do a video when I've got hay fever, but thanks so much for watching. I'll catch up with you again soon.